Chapter 2, Planning of English America. This is the beginning of the English colonization of America. Exciting stuff. So, England abandons Catholicism. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII was having trouble getting a boy child from his current wife, so he chose to divorce her. The problem is that the Catholic Church would not let him. Because of this, Henry VIII chooses to break away from the Catholic Church and begins England's own Protestant Reformation. He forms the Church of England, making the monarch of England the actual Pope of the Church of England. So, with that said, from then on, the English nation was a Protestant nation. His daughter Elizabeth I, which is actually a few monarchs down, you can see Henry VIII is followed by Edward VI and then Bloody Mary. And you can see them kind of waffling between Protestantism and Catholic in the Catholic faith. So when Elizabeth I takes over, she reinforces Protestantism in England as the official religion, and this puts them at odds with their soon-to-be rival Spain. Spain did not like the offense that Henry VIII had uh, done toward the Catholic Church, and so they attempt to aid the Irish in a fellow Catholic revolt in the 1570s 80s against England. Elizabeth, however, and the English are able to crush the uprising, and the rivalry between the Protestant English and Catholic Spanish continues to grow. In this same conflict, the English develop a sneering contempt for the savage Irish. So we tend to think of racism and nativism as a battle between two different races, but most people wouldn't consider English and Irish as different races because they're both white and from the same general region. This shows you that racism isn't just always black versus white or any other skin color, it's usually cultural. The English bring the same hatred of the Irish to America, where they will apply that to the Native Americans. So, with this woman, Elizabeth I, leading, England is able to rise from another European nation to one at the very top of the hierarchy. She strengthens England by expanding and allowing the first attempts at New World colonization. So a few people try to explore and colonize, including Sir Walter Raleigh's half-brother, who disappears after trying to create a colony in Newfoundland. After he disappears, his half-brother Raleigh takes over and creates a settlement on Roanoke Island. Roanoke Island was a doomed venture, although it was successful initially. When Raleigh and his men go back to get supplies, they are stopped from returning to help them out because of the growing conflict with the Spanish. So why are they fighting the Spanish? Well, England had been encouraging men like Sir Francis Drake to be pirates and to rob Spanish treasure ships. They figured, why build an entire colony and new nation when we can just rob Spain of their wealth? So, with this conflict growing, the Spanish decide to create an armada to invade England. Unfortunately for the Spanish, in 1588, their armada is defeated as they try to encircle the island, and many of their ships are lost. So, with the Spanish armada sunk, Spain is on the decline from here on out as a world power, whereas England rises as the master of the sea, a position they won't yield all the way to World War II. So, where did this leave Roanoke? Well, Roanoke, without any more supplies, dwindled in its population, and by the time Raleigh and his people came back to Roanoke Island, they had disappeared. So, on the eve of empire, what caused England to expand? Well, there's numerous causes, as listed here on this slide. England experienced strong economic and social changes, creating a surplus population. What this means is because of their economic boom and because of their ability to feed their people and have those opportunities, their people were well fed and growing. The issue with this is you now have people who don't have, or there's too many people to have jobs to provide for. So they needed to expand in order to find a way to best use their population. Thus, expansion was a great solution for those people. Primogeniture is also something that helps them expand. So primogeniture is where the firstborn in each family, the firstborn male, receives everything from their family. So a secondborn, thirdborn, fourthborn son would not inherit anything. This encouraged them to explore and to expand beyond just trying to follow in the family footsteps. Men like Sir Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, and even Prince Henry the Navigator from Chapter 1 were all men who were not the firstborn, and thus they were forced into things like expansion or exploring in order to make a living for themselves. Another guy named Richard Hakluyt also makes the case for expanding. As you can see it in this slide, he believed that Virginia was a land that was, quote, so rich and abundant in silver mines, a better and richer country than Mexico itself. Even though he'd never been to Virginia, which is rather ironic, He believed that it was the spot where they would enrich England beyond their wildest dreams. Meanwhile, you can see on the other side of this slide, George Percy, who had actually been there, describes it as a place of, quote, such misery as we were in this new discovered Virginia. He said that they had never experienced a place worse than that. Regardless, Richard Hakluyt is able to encourage Elizabeth and the English to expand. The joint stock companies also help out a lot in that people are able to gather their money together and form companies that look for easy profits in the New World. So the most famous example is the Virginia Company, who we'll talk about in just a second. Many people with money combine their funds, get a charter from the king, and are able to get land in the New World where they plan to find gold and make a quick profit for everyone, including the crown. And thus they would have a return on investment. So joint stock companies is a new type of business that arises in this time period that allowed people to make money by investing in exploration. And then finally, a peace treaty with Spain following the defeat of the Spanish Armada. This relative peace enabled them to search and explore without the fear of being caught up in a war should they do so. So, surplus population, primogeniture, advertising by Hakluyt, joint stock companies, and relative peace with Spain enabled them to explore. Which brings us to the very first permanent English colony in Jamestown. So James I, when he became king, granted a charter, which is to say a parcel of land in the New World, for the Virginia Company to settle. With their funds, they create Jamestown. They send a few hundred men to create this colony. Unfortunately for those settlers, much like Percy warned them, it is not exactly a good place to live. There's water. The water is very swampy, and combining with the sea, the salt water from the sea, means that it's just not a very clean and easy to survive place. You have diseases rising from the swamp and the mosquitoes in the area. And also, the focus of the adventurers on digging gold rather than planting crops or preparing themselves for winter means that they die in droves when winter arrives. If it weren't for John Smith, who saves the colony by instituting his important rule, he who does not work shall not eat, they may not have survived the winter. He forced them into growing crops and to rationing their food. Those who broke those rules and either didn't work, well, they starved, and those who tried to eat more than they were allotted, they were punished harshly, some of them with death, but some of them just by being exiled from their settlement. In the winter of 1608 and 1609, John Smith had actually returned home. So with that break of, I guess you could say, structure, they end up almost starving themselves to death during that winter time. Luckily for them, or maybe unluckily, depending on your perspective, they have reinforcements arrive, which gets them to stay in the Chesapeake area. So the man who arrives in 1610 is a guy named Lord de la Warr. And the reason he was sent there in 1610 was he was going to organize Jamestown and also handle the issues that had been created with the Powhatan tribe. So the Powhatan tribe of Native Americans had been very friendly towards the Englishmen, but soon they grew frustrated with what was going on. The reason being, initially, trade was very even. The Englishmen had weapons and technology that the Powhatan tribe wanted, and the Powhatan tribe had the food and things to help keep the Englishmen supplied. But as winter arrived, and the Powhatan tribe didn't need those weapons as badly, they were getting raided and, well, just frustrated as well with the Englishmen depending upon them, and so a short war broke out. So Lord de la Warr helps lead the first Anglo-Powhatan War against the Powhatan tribe, and that ends with Pocahontas marrying John Rolfe. But that didn't settle on anything, so 30 years later there's a second war, and this ends after the Indians' last attempt to eradicate the English fails. The Englishmen are able to defeat the Powhatan tribe, and they are defeated and pushed further west, a theme that we will see throughout the course and throughout American history for Native Americans. So what enabled Powhatan and his tribes to be defeated by the English? There are several different things, and for the sake of this course, we'll summarize them in the 3 Ds. First, you have disease. Disease is, well, responsible for 90% of Native American deaths, according to most historians. So with 90% of their population taken care of by diseases, it was much easier for the English and other groups to defeat the Native Americans. Then you have disorganization. Powhatan was a powerful tribe, and because of that, they made a lot of enemies trying to control all the smaller tribes in the area. So what happens is the English would get those tribes to organize against the Powhatan tribe, and after they were defeated, the English would then divide those tribes up and continue them fighting against one another rather than joining together against the English. So this disorganization of Native Americans also cost them dearly. Then finally, disposability. The only thing the English wanted from Native Americans was their land. And because of that, That means that the Indians were actually themselves very disposable. So when it comes between choosing between land and treating Indians humanely or fairly, the English always chose the land, and that forces Indians to be pushed out of their way violently. So as far as Native American culture, it is drastically changed by the Europeans coming here, with horses changing their transportation and modes of warfare, disease obviously affecting not only how many are alive, but also their alliances, where they lived, and forced many different tribes to actually combine, and of course the Atlantic economy, which we'll touch more on in the future chapters. As far as Virginia, how did it continue to develop following the defeat of the Powhatan tribe and throughout this entire time period? In 1612, rather than digging for gold, John Rolfe was able to perfect the tobacco culture. The Virginia economy came to solely rely on this one cash crop. So Virginia fully committed itself to tobacco. The problem with that is that tobacco depletes the soil, and it also requires lots of labor. So since tobacco depletes the soil, that brought them into conflicts with Native Americans naturally as they pushed west for more land. But they also had to bring in loads and loads of workers. Initially, in Virginia and the southern colonies, they relied mostly upon indentured servants. Servants would serve anywhere from 3 to 5 to 7 to 10, depending on which textbook you look at, and depending on each servant's contract. But these indentured servants would serve for that many years, and when they were done, they would be free to live in the New World and potentially, in some cases, granted land. Over time, more slaves are brought in to work, but as we'll discuss in a future chapter, those slaves are not exactly how we envisioned initially. Many of them were able to earn manumission, and many of them were temporary workers until they paid off their costs. But with that said, for a long time, Virginia relied upon indentured servants more than they did slave labor to collect and grow, harvest, and sell their tobacco. One other thing about Virginia is that they are able to develop one of the first representative self-government bodies in their House of Burgesses. Men in the colony were able to get elected, and they would choose their taxes, how that tax money was spent, how to defend the colony from Native Americans or potentially Spanish. And so this mini parliament is the very first example of what I guess we could consider democracy in America. People voting and representing themselves on how the government's run. By 1624, however, the king grew suspicious of this house. He gets rid of Virginia Company's charter and makes it a royal colony, meaning that a royal governor would now control the colony rather than a company. And it also limits the power of the House of Burgesses. So, this brings us to this second colony that's founded, that's Maryland. Unlike Virginia, which was founded by a joint stock company, Maryland was a proprietary colony, meaning that the king grants a piece of land to someone else, and they basically own it. This land given to the wealthy friends of Lord Baltimore was meant to provide a haven for Catholics, a place where they could worship freely without fear of any kind of persecution. If you remember back in England, there were major issues between Protestants and Catholics, meaning that Lord Baltimore was probably looking for somewhere where he knew he could be safe. With that said, he had to bring in a lot of workers because not only did they want safety for Catholics, they also wanted money off of massive plantations. And so as they bring in these indentured servants, most of them were actually Protestant. And this creates conflict between the Catholic leaders and wealthy class and the indentured servant Protestant class. The Protestants actually push out the Catholic leaders until the Catholic leader comes back and convinces them to agree to the Act of Toleration. This Act of Toleration says that all Christian faiths would be tolerated. Problem is, they weren't nearly as tolerant of other faiths, including Jews and those who didn't believe in God, atheists, who would receive the death penalty. So although the Act of Toleration continued to give Catholics protection, it did not give protection to all groups like the name would seem to imply. This brings us to the West Indies. The West Indies, also known as, well, we would consider the Caribbean, had a lot of islands that were very rich in sugar. And so England was able to purchase several of these West Indian islands, and when they did, they made a lot of money off of it. The problem with sugar is it is even more work intensive than tobacco, meaning they need a massive amount of workers. With the native population depleted, African slaves began to be brought into the Caribbean. Slaves eventually would outnumber whites 4-1 on the island, leading to a lot of fear. With them being massively outnumbered, they decided to pass a slave code that defined their slaves' legal status and how they could control them. Now, this included a lot of different things, but the biggest thing it included is this rule right here. Basically, if you read through there, you see in the last sentence, and it is further enacted and ordained that if any man or other slave under punishment by his master unfortunately suffer in life or member which seldom happens, no person whatsoever shall be liable to any fine thereof. In other words, you could maim or kill your slave, and there was going to be no punishment. So you can understand how this Barbados slave code led to slaves being subservient and fearful of death because their owner would not face any consequences at all for what they did to them. So, why is this Barbados slave code part of American history? The wealthier groups in the islands were able to purchase the land from the smaller landowners. And with that money, those men decided to purchase land in Carolina. When they came to America, not only did they bring their slaves with them, they also brought the slave code. And unfortunately, that slave code spread around the colonies and made slavery more codified until it becomes eventually what we call today chattel slavery. Term, again, in another chapter. So when we look at the Carolinas, how are the Carolinas settled? Well, much like Maryland, it was a proprietary colony. In fact, the 8 Lord Proprietors, whom the king owed a favor, were able to be granted the land around Charlestown. When Charlestown is created, it quickly becomes a society of wealthy plantation owners. They were able to survive early Indian and Spanish attacks, as you can see with New Spain towards the south. The Spanish tried to invade and get rid of South Carolina and its English rivals. Wealthy plantation owners, however, are able to survive it and eventually create massive plantations that will have a lot of wealth. Unlike Virginia, their primary crop is rice. It makes them, well, as a foodstuff that help supply not only the colonies but also England with food to survive. They're able to grow and flourish. So initially that was just Carolina. So when does it split into North and South Carolina? Well, as indentured servants and other groups come to America, they don't like being under the control of these planter elites. These plantation owners tried to push them around and many times would not grant them the land that they had been promised when their indenture was done. So many of these rebellious groups would be called squatters because they would go in the land between Virginia and South Carolina and squat on it and claim it was their land. If anyone came to challenge them on it, they would, well, fight for it. So neither Carolina nor Virginia wanted to claim these rebellious men. And so what they ended up choosing to do is in 1712, they allowed the land between them to become North Carolina. Carolina splits into North and South, and thus we have 2 separate colonies. So North Carolina ends up being one of the most democratic, independent-minded, and least aristocratic colonies because of this. If you fast forward to the Revolution, North Carolina is one of the last to actually adopt the Constitution in the late 1780s. That's because they didn't want to give up power to a larger federal government. Furthermore, they continue the same idea of the southern colonies, which is warfare against the Indians as they expand. In 1711 to 1713, they fight the Tuscarora War, in which they fight with the Yamasee Indians, once again representing that disorganization. And they are able to devastate most of the coastal tribes. After they defeat the Tuscarora, they then turn on the Yamasee Indians. So disorganization and disposability can be seen in North Carolina's treatment and interaction with Indians. This brings us to the Carolinas, in which we have a civil war in England delaying further colonization after the Carolinas. Oops. Wrong way. Georgia. We'd already went over Carolina. Georgia, the buffer colony. In 1733, the last colony to be formed, it was launched by philanthropists and named in honor of King George II. So these philanthropists, what they saw is a lot of people in prison, whether that be debtor's prison or having committed a crime. They saw this as an opportunity to give those people a second chance at life, as well as give them a chance to defend the more profitable colonies. So James Oglethorpe, he wanted this to be a slave-free colony, so only people would own the land. Debtors and rehabilitated prisoners would come, and they would help defend them from Spanish and Indian attacks. Oglethorpe led the military and defended it. So the reason why Georgia is called the buffer colony, and sometimes also called the charity colony, is because these rehabilitated men were able to be an important buffer between, as you can see there, Spain and Carolina. So you see that red area of Georgia defending them from invasion. So Savannah, the city, ends up becoming a thriving melting pot community. And when the revolution occurs, it is actually the only colony to remain loyal to the crown, waiting until it was over to actually join the other colonies. So questions to consider yourself. Which colonies were most similar to each other? We have a map here with some of their economic things, but think about how they were founded or what their population was made of. Which are the most similar and which are the most different? And then try to think of words that would describe the southern colonies. That is it, and I hope you enjoyed Chapter 2. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. Thank you.